January 30th, 1943, 26,000 feet above Berlin. The sky is a hard winter blue, so clear it almost feels brittle. Inside the cockpit of a de Havilland Mosquito B.4, Flight Lieutenant Bill Kendall keeps his gloved hands steady on the control column as the city unfolds beneath him. The engines, two Rolls-Royce Merlins, do not roar the way heavy bombers do. They hum, smooth and confident, a sound closer to speed than brute force. Frost rims the canopy. Oxygen hisses softly. Somewhere behind him, his navigator checks the stopwatch again. Below, Berlin is awake. It is Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring's birthday. Banners hang from government buildings. Loudspeakers are already being set up for a midday speech meant to celebrate German air power and promise final victory. And at this very moment, a British airplane, made mostly of wood, is slipping through German airspace in broad daylight, unchallenged. Kendall glances at the airspeed indicator. Over 380 miles per hour. No escort fighters. No defensive guns. No formation. Just one aircraft, alone, relying entirely on speed and altitude. This is not how bombers are supposed to fight a war. The navigator calls out calmly. 1 minute. Anti-aircraft batteries begin to stir below, black puffs appearing far behind them. The gunners are firing where they think the aircraft should be, not where it is. The Mosquito is already past them. At exactly the planned second, Kendall releases the bombs. They fall cleanly, arcing down toward the government district. Seconds later, smoke rises from near the broadcasting hall. Göring's speech will be delayed. German radio will scramble for explanations. And somewhere in the Luftwaffe command structure, an uncomfortable question will surface yet again. What is that airplane? For years, the very idea of a wooden combat aircraft had been laughed at. To understand why this moment over Berlin mattered, why a single unescorted bomber could humiliate the heart of the Third Reich, you have to go back to Britain in 1938, when the Mosquito existed only as an idea that almost no one wanted. In the late 1930s, the Royal Air Force was obsessed with weight, armor, and guns. Bombers bristled with defensive turrets. Fighters were judged by how many machine guns they could carry. Speed was important, but survivability was thought to come from firepower and formation flying. Wood, to most senior planners, belonged to training aircraft and museums. Geoffrey de Havilland thought differently. De Havilland was not a flashy man. A pioneer aviator and engineer, he believed in efficiency above all else. His company had decades of experience building wooden aircraft, and he understood something many in the Air Ministry did not. A lighter airframe, properly designed, could outperform heavier metal aircraft in every meaningful way. Speed, he believed, was the best defense. In 1938, as war loomed, de Havilland proposed a radical concept. A twin-engine bomber with no defensive guns. No armor plating. Built largely of wood, spruce, birch, and balsa, materials that would not compete with metal-hungry Spitfire and Hurricane production. It would carry a respectable bomb load and fly so fast that enemy fighters would be unable to catch it. The response from the Air Ministry was, at best, skeptical. Some officials dismissed the idea outright. A wooden bomber, they said, would be fragile. It would burn. It would not survive combat. Others saw it as a dangerous distraction when Britain needed proven designs, not experiments. One senior figure reportedly scoffed that such an aircraft might be suitable for peacetime racing, but not for war against Germany. Across the Channel, German intelligence would later echo that same sentiment. When reports surfaced of a fast British aircraft built of wood, Luftwaffe analysts reportedly laughed. Wood meant outdated, obsolete, something left over from the First World War. But de Havilland persisted. Working largely with private funding at first, his team refined the design. The aircraft would have a clean, aerodynamic shape, uninterrupted by gun turrets. The fuselage would be a sandwich of plywood and balsa, molded under pressure into a smooth, strong shell. The wings would be long and efficient, and most importantly, it would be powered by the most advanced engine Britain had. 2 Merlins. When the prototype finally flew on November 25, 1940, from Hatfield Aerodrome, the results stunned even some of its creators. The Mosquito was faster than many RAF fighters. faster, in fact, than the German Messerschmitt Bf 109 at certain altitudes. Test pilots returned grinning, speaking of how responsive it felt, how solid, how deceptively gentle for something so quick. Still, doubts lingered. Britain was fighting for survival. The Blitz had torn through London and other cities. Resources were stretched thin. Putting faith in an unarmed, wooden bomber seemed like a gamble the nation could not afford. But war has a way of rewarding those willing to rethink everything. By the time Flight Lieutenant Kendall's Mosquito skimmed over Berlin in January 1943, the laughter had stopped. The wooden airplane was no longer a curiosity. It was a weapon, and the Germans were only beginning to understand how dangerous it truly was. In the weeks after the prototype's first flight, the Mosquito existed in a strange limbo. It had proven itself in the air, but wars are not won by prototypes. They are won by production lines, doctrine, and the willingness of commanders to trust something unorthodox when everything familiar is failing. Britain in late 1940 was exhausted. The Battle of Britain had ended only months earlier. Fighter Command had survived, but just barely. Bomber Command, under Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles Portal, was under intense pressure to strike back at Germany, yet its losses were alarming. Heavily armed bombers like the Wellington and Hampton were being shot down in daylight and at night alike. The idea that more guns would save them was proving increasingly hollow. Into this grim reality came de Havilland's wooden aircraft. The first production order was cautious, almost symbolic. A handful of airframes, designated the Mosquito B.4, were authorized. They would be evaluated not as a frontline bomber, but as a fast reconnaissance aircraft. If it failed, the loss would be tolerable. If it succeeded, the implications were enormous. Construction itself was an experiment. Britain's traditional aircraft factories were overwhelmed, so de Havilland turned to furniture makers, piano builders, and cabinet workshops. Craftsmen skilled in wood, glue, and precision shaping. In quiet factories far from Luftwaffe bombing, fuselage halves were molded like fine instruments. Workers who had never built an airplane before were suddenly contributing to the war in a way no one had anticipated. There was skepticism even among pilots. Squadron leader John Cunningham, already famous as a night fighter ace, later recalled his first look at the Mosquito with mixed feelings. Felt light, almost too light. The idea of taking it deep into enemy territory without guns seemed reckless. British bomber crews had grown used to the comfort, illusory as it was, of defensive turrets and overlapping fields of fire. But once they flew it, doubts began to erode. The Mosquito climbed faster than expected. It cruised effortlessly at altitudes where flak was thin and inaccurate. In mock combat exercises, it outran Spitfires. Pilots found that the aircraft responded instantly to control inputs, its wooden frame absorbing stress rather than cracking under it. Damage that might have shattered metal structures was often localized, reparable. And then came the first operational missions. In September 1941, Mosquitoes flew their first reconnaissance sorties over occupied Europe. They returned with crystal-clear photographs of German ports, airfields, and industrial targets. German fighters scrambled but failed to intercept them. Anti-aircraft fire lagged behind, bursting uselessly in empty sky. Word spread quickly through RAF circles. This airplane could go anywhere. Bomber Command took notice. If the Mosquito could penetrate enemy airspace alone and survive, perhaps it could do more than take pictures. Perhaps it could carry bombs, not in mass formations but precisely. Perhaps it could strike targets that had previously been unreachable or too costly to attack. The idea clashed with Bomber Command's prevailing doctrine. By 1942, Britain had committed fully to area bombing. Thousands of aircraft, flying at night, saturating entire cities. Precision was sacrificed for volume. Losses were accepted as the price of pressure. The Mosquito offered something different. Not replacement, but disruption. The first bombing missions were small, almost experimental. A single aircraft here, 2 aircraft there. Targets were carefully chosen. Gestapo headquarters, railway control centers, radio stations. The aircraft would arrive with little warning, drop its bombs, and be gone before German defenses could react. One such raid, in Oslo in September 1942, targeted the Gestapo headquarters. Flying low through fjords, mosquitoes struck the building with devastating accuracy. Prisoners were freed. German administrators were killed. The psychological effect far outweighed the physical damage. Across occupied Europe, whispers began to circulate. The British had a new weapon, one that struck without warning and vanished into the clouds. German air defense commanders were frustrated. Reports described a high-speed twin-engine aircraft, difficult to detect, harder to intercept. Fighter pilots complained their aircraft could not catch it. Radar operators struggled to track it consistently. Flak crews fired blindly. And always the same baffling detail surfaced. The aircraft appeared to be made of wood. In Germany, this detail was not taken seriously at first. Luftwaffe engineers prided themselves on metal construction and advanced alloys. A wooden aircraft, they reasoned, could not possibly withstand combat stress. It must be propaganda, or a misunderstanding, or a niche design that would never be produced in large numbers. They were wrong on all counts. By late 1942, Mosquito production was accelerating. New variants emerged almost monthly: bombers, night fighters, reconnaissance aircraft, Pathfinders. Each role exploited the same fundamental advantage: speed. The Mosquito did not fight the enemy on their terms. It refused to engage. It refused to linger. It appeared where it was least expected, struck with surgical precision, and left confusion in its wake. For the crews who flew it, confidence grew with every mission. They began to trust the aircraft in a way bomber crews rarely did. They knew that if they kept their speed up and their navigation precise, the Mosquito would bring them home. For German defenders, confidence eroded. And somewhere deep within the Luftwaffe's technical offices, the laughter that had once greeted reports of a wooden British bomber was beginning to fade, replaced by something far more dangerous: concern. By early 1943, the Mosquito was no longer an experiment whispered about in briefing rooms. It was a known quantity, one that unsettled both sides of the war. In Britain, operational planners began to realize that speed itself could be wielded like a blade. In Germany, air defense commanders were confronting a reality they had not prepared for: an enemy aircraft that refused to behave like a bomber at all. The Luftwaffe had built its defensive doctrine around interception. Radar would detect incoming raids. Fighters would be vectored toward bomber streams. Flak belts would be laid at predictable altitudes. The Mosquito shattered this logic. It did not arrive in streams. It did not loiter. It did not fly at the altitudes planners expected. By the time German defenses reacted, the aircraft was often already gone. This was not theory. It was happening over and over again. On January 31, 1943, just one day after the Berlin birthday raid, another Mosquito mission struck the German capital in broad daylight. Once again, it was a nuisance raid, small bomb load, symbolic target. But the message was unmistakable. British aircraft could reach Berlin at will, and Germany could not stop them. Inside the Reich Air Ministry, frustration grew. Hermann Göring, once the proud architect of German air power, was livid. He had promised the German people that no enemy aircraft would ever bomb Berlin. Now, wooden British planes were doing so almost casually. According to later accounts, Göring raged about the Mosquito in private meetings. He complained bitterly that the British were building airplanes out of piano factories, while Germany struggled to counter them. The comment, meant as an insult, revealed a deeper truth. German industry had underestimated what British improvisation could achieve. The Luftwaffe tried to respond. New interception tactics were tested. Fighters were ordered to climb faster, patrol higher. Specialized units were tasked with hunting Mosquitoes. Radar frequencies were adjusted. Even new aircraft designs were accelerated, all in an effort to regain control of the airspace that seemed to be slipping away. But the Mosquito kept evolving. The B.4 bomber variant was followed by the B.9, capable of carrying heavier bomb loads at even greater speeds. Photo reconnaissance versions ranged deep into enemy territory, mapping targets for future raids with a clarity unmatched by slower aircraft. Night fighter variants were equipped with radar and heavy cannons, turning the Mosquito into a hunter of German bombers over Britain. Perhaps most importantly, the aircraft found a critical role with the Pathfinder force. Bomber Command's night raids depended on accurate marking of targets. Pathfinders flew ahead of the main force, identifying the target and dropping flares to guide the bombers. It was one of the most dangerous jobs in the RAF. Slow aircraft were vulnerable. Losses were high. The Mosquito changed that equation. Flying faster and higher than most German night fighters, Mosquito Pathfinders could reach targets first, drop their markers with precision, and escape before defenses concentrated. Their accuracy improved the effectiveness of entire bomber streams. One aircraft, unarmed, could influence the outcome of a raid involving hundreds of bombers. Crews felt the difference immediately. Wing Commander Don Bennett, head of the Pathfinder force, became one of the Mosquito's strongest advocates. He understood that precision was power. Under his command, Mosquito units refined techniques for low-level navigation, timed attacks, and deceptive routing. They learned to exploit gaps in radar coverage, to approach targets from unexpected directions, to use weather as an ally rather than an obstacle. Each mission added to a growing sense of mastery. But it was not without risk. Flying a Mosquito demanded constant attention. There were no gunners to watch the skies, no armor to absorb mistakes. If a fighter did get close, the only defense was speed and the pilot's nerve. Crews learned to trust their instruments, their training, and each other completely. Navigator errors could be fatal. A misjudged turn could place the aircraft directly over a flak battery or into the path of interceptors. At low level, a moment's distraction could mean disaster. Trees, power lines, church spires, everything was a threat. Yet despite these dangers, loss rates remained remarkably low. German pilots who did encounter Mosquitoes often described the experience with a mix of admiration and irritation. They could see the aircraft. They could close the distance slightly. But just as they prepared to fire, the Mosquito would pull away, engines screaming, leaving nothing but exhaust and frustration behind. The realization began to sink in. The wooden airplane was not a gimmick. It was not a stopgap. It was a fundamentally different approach to aerial warfare, one that exploited agility and speed rather than brute force. And it was forcing Germany to divert resources, rethink defenses, and chase a threat that refused to be pinned down. For Britain, fighting a war of survival and attrition, that mattered enormously. The laughter that had once followed reports of a wooden bomber was gone now, replaced by grudging respect and growing fear. February 18, 1944. Just after noon, northern France. The Mosquitoes skim in low over the frozen countryside, so low that snow lifts in swirling sheets behind them. Church bells, startled birds, the sudden roar of engines. Everything happens at once. Inside the lead aircraft, Group Captain Percy Pickard watches the seconds tick away, his eyes flicking between the horizon and the clock mounted beside the canopy. Timing is everything now. Seconds too early, and the prisoners will still be locked inside their cells. Seconds too late, and German guards will have time to react. Ahead lies Amiens prison. This is not a bombing raid in the traditional sense. There will be no carpet of explosives, no firestorm, no bomber stream stretching for miles. Instead, there will be precision measured in feet and heartbeats. The Mosquitoes must breach the outer walls, shatter specific cell blocks, and do it all at rooftop height. Fast enough to escape, accurate enough to avoid killing the very men they are trying to free. Operation Jericho is one of the most audacious missions ever attempted by the RAF. And it exists only because of the Mosquito. As the aircraft drop even lower, flak erupts around them. Not the heavy, calculated bursts seen over cities, but frantic small arms fire from guards and nearby units caught completely off guard. Pickard steadies the aircraft. He does not pull up. He does not hesitate. The first bombs strike the outer wall exactly as planned. Masonry explodes outward. The second wave hits the cell blocks. Roofs collapse. Doors are blown open. Inside the prison, chaos reigns, but so does opportunity. Within minutes, the Mosquitoes are gone, racing back toward the channel at treetop height. Pickard's aircraft does not make it home. He is killed during the attack. But hundreds of prisoners escape, including members of the French resistance scheduled for execution. The mission's success and its cost send shockwaves through both Allied and German command structures. For the Germans, the implications are chilling. If British aircraft can fly into occupied France at noon, at rooftop height, strike a single building with pinpoint accuracy, and escape almost unscathed, then nowhere is truly safe. Not prisons, not headquarters, not transportation hubs, not even Berlin itself. For Britain, the Mosquito has crossed a threshold. It is no longer merely a fast bomber or reconnaissance platform. It is a surgical instrument, capable of shaping events on the ground in ways no other aircraft can. Throughout 1944, these missions multiply. Mosquitoes strike Gestapo headquarters in Copenhagen, disrupting German intelligence operations. They attack railway control centers ahead of D-Day, paralyzing German troop movements without alerting commanders to the broader invasion plan. They raid V-weapon sites, hitting launch facilities before they can be used against London. Each mission is planned with obsessive detail. Routes are rehearsed. Timings are synchronized down to the second. Crews memorize landmarks, river bends, factory roofs. There is no margin for error. German defenses struggle to adapt. Fighter patrols are reinforced, but Mosquitoes fly beneath radar coverage or above interception altitudes. Flak units are repositioned, but the aircraft approach from unexpected directions, exploiting gaps created by Germany's own defensive rigidity. Even when a Mosquito is hit, its wooden structure often absorbs damage that would cripple a metal aircraft, allowing crews to limp home. The irony is impossible to miss. Germany, once the world leader in advanced aviation, is being outmaneuvered by an aircraft built from materials it had dismissed as primitive. Within the Luftwaffe, frustration gives way to admiration and envy. Engineers study captured fragments, noting the strength of the plywood sandwich construction, the smooth aerodynamic surfaces. Some quietly acknowledge that the British have found a way around material shortages not by compromise, but by innovation. But by now, it is too late to copy. German industry is stretched to the breaking point. Bombing raids, many guided by Mosquito Pathfinders, are tearing at factories and transportation networks. Fuel shortages ground aircraft. Experienced pilots are dead or scattered. Even if a Mosquito-like design were approved, there is no time to bring it to fruition. The wooden airplane continues to operate with near impunity. For Mosquito crews, the war becomes a strange blend of confidence and fatalism. They know their aircraft gives them an edge, but they also know that one mistake, one lucky shell, one unseen cable or mast at low level will end everything instantly. They fly anyway, because the Mosquito has proven something profound, that intelligence, precision, and speed can rival mass and brute force, that an idea once laughed at can reshape the way wars are fought. And as 1944 turns toward its bloody conclusion, the Mosquito's role is far from over. June 6, 1944. Night over southern England. The airfield is alive with motion, but there is no shouting, no bravado. Ground crews work by shaded lights, their hands moving from memory. A Mosquito NF.13 sits at the edge of the runway, its dark paint swallowing the glow of the lamps. Inside the cockpit, Flight Lieutenant Edward Ted Sayers adjusts his oxygen mask while his radar operator, Flying Officer Alan Brooks, studies the green glow of the scope. Tonight, they are not bombers. They are hunters. As the Allied invasion armada moves toward Normandy, German bombers attempt to strike ports, troop concentrations, and shipping lanes. The Luftwaffe is a shadow of what it once was, but even a weakened force can still kill. Stopping those aircraft before they reach the beaches is critical. The Mosquito is perfectly suited to the task. When Sayers advances the throttles, the Merlins respond instantly. The aircraft surges forward, lifting cleanly into the night sky. Within minutes, they are climbing through scattered cloud, radar scanning the darkness ahead. Unlike earlier night fighters, the Mosquito does not rely on ground controllers alone. Its onboard radar allows it to search, track, and intercept independently. Brooks leans closer to the screen. A contact appears, faint, then stronger. Range 6 miles. Slightly below us. Sayers adjusts course. The Mosquito accelerates, the airframe vibrating subtly as speed builds. There is no sense of strain, no feeling that the aircraft is being pushed beyond its limits. It was built for this. Ahead, a German Ju-88 bomber plods through the darkness, its crew unaware that death is closing in from behind and above. The Mosquito slides into position. Cannons fire. The night erupts in flame. The Ju-88 disappears in a burst of orange and black. Sayers does not circle to confirm the kill. He does not slow down. Another contact is already forming on the radar. This is the other side of the Mosquito's legacy, one less visible, but just as devastating. As a night fighter, the Mosquito becomes one of the most effective aircraft of the entire war. Faster than the bombers it hunts, heavily armed, and equipped with increasingly sophisticated radar, it turns the night sky into hostile territory for German crews. Losses mount. Morale plummets. German bomber pilots begin to fear the darkness itself. Once again, the aircraft's construction plays a role. The wooden frame produces a smaller radar return than metal aircraft, making the Mosquito harder to detect. Its speed allows it to choose when to engage and when to disengage. It fights on its own terms, just as it always has. By late 1944, the Mosquito is everywhere. Over Germany, Pathfinders mark targets for massive raids. Over occupied Europe, strike aircraft cripple rail networks and command centers. Over Britain, night fighters guard the skies. Over the North Sea, reconnaissance variants track shipping and U-boat movements. It is one of the few aircraft to excel in every role assigned to it. German leadership can no longer deny its impact. Reports stack up describing an enemy aircraft that cannot be caught, cannot be predicted, cannot be stopped reliably. The Mosquito forces the diversion of fighters from the front lines, flak from cities, resources from already strained production. All for an aircraft that was once dismissed as a joke. For the men who fly it, the Mosquito becomes more than a machine. Crews give their aircraft names, personalize them, speak of them with something approaching affection. Trust is absolute. When they push the throttles forward, they believe correctly that the aircraft will respond. That trust is not misplaced. Statistics after the war will show what crews already know. The Mosquito's loss rate is among the lowest of any RAF aircraft in comparable roles. It brings its crews home more often than not. In a war defined by sacrifice, that matters more than almost anything. As 1945 approaches, Germany is collapsing. Fuel is scarce. Pilots are inexperienced. Air defenses are fragmented. The Mosquito continues to fly missions until the final weeks of the war, striking targets that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. The wooden airplane that was never supposed to survive combat has outlived many of its critics and many of its enemies. May 3, 1945. Northern Germany. The war is almost over, though no one quite knows how to act like it yet. A Mosquito PR.16 cruises high above a scarred landscape of shattered rail yards and smoking towns. Below, columns of refugees clog the roads. Bridges lie twisted in rivers. The Reich that once promised 1,000 years is collapsing in weeks. Inside the cockpit, the pilot keeps the aircraft steady while the navigator marks the last photographs of the war. These images will be studied later, filed away, turned into evidence. For now, the aircraft flies on. There is no dramatic interception, no flak bursts, no fighters rising to challenge it. The German air defense network, once so feared, has simply stopped functioning. Fuel shortages have grounded aircraft. Radar stations are abandoned or destroyed. Commands contradict each other or no longer exist at all. The Mosquito passes overhead unseen. For the crews, this final phase of the war is surreal. They have grown used to danger, to constant vigilance, to the sharp edge of speed keeping them alive. Now, they fly through empty skies, the engine's steady rhythm echoing in a silence that feels heavier than combat ever did. When Germany surrenders days later, Mosquito units stand down almost without ceremony. Aircraft that have flown hundreds of missions are parked wingtip to wingtip on muddy airfields. Ground crews, who once worked through the night to turn damaged aircraft around for the next sortie, now wait for instructions that may never come. Some pilots feel relief. Others feel a strange sense of loss. The Mosquito had become their war. In the weeks that follow, analysts begin the slow process of understanding what has just happened. They tally missions flown, bombs dropped, photographs taken, aircraft lost. Patterns emerge quickly. Wherever the Mosquito operated, German defenses were strained disproportionately. Targets once considered too risky or too precise suddenly became vulnerable. The conclusions are unavoidable. The Mosquito did not win the war by itself, but it changed how the war was fought. It proved that bombers did not need to be lumbering fortresses bristling with guns. It proved that precision could sometimes achieve more than mass. It proved that speed and adaptability could offset numerical disadvantage. And perhaps most importantly, it proved that innovation did not always mean more steel, more weight, or more complexity. Sometimes it meant trusting an idea that sounded absurd. After the war, captured German documents confirm what Allied planners had suspected. The Mosquito was a constant irritation at every level of German command. It forced changes in radar deployment, pulled fighters away from other fronts. It undermined morale by striking symbolic targets with impunity. It made senior leaders look foolish in front of their own people. One Luftwaffe officer reportedly summarized it bluntly in a post-war interview. The Mosquito, he said, was the aircraft we feared most, because we could never be sure where it would appear next. Yet despite its success, the Mosquito does not fit neatly into post-war narratives. The world rushes toward jet engines, swept wings, and aluminum alloys. What feels old-fashioned again. Many Mosquitoes are scrapped within a few years, their airframes broken down, their engines reused or discarded. A handful are preserved, tucked away in museums, their smooth wooden surfaces still bearing the marks of wartime service. To the untrained eye, they look almost fragile. Those who know better see something else. They see an aircraft born from constraint, shaped by necessity, and perfected by courage. They see the fingerprints of furniture makers and engineers, pilots and navigators, planners and skeptics. They see proof that wars are not won only by those with the most resources, but by those willing to rethink the problem entirely. In the end, the laughter that once greeted the Mosquito's conception becomes one of history's great misjudgments. The wooden airplane did not just survive the war. It defined an era of it. And long after the engines fell silent, its legacy continued, etched into the way air forces around the world thought about speed, precision, and the true meaning of strength. Autumn 1946. Farnborough, England. The airfield smells of oil and wet grass, the same as it always has, but the mood is different now. The war is over. The crowds that gather along the flight line are no longer watching for survival, but for spectacle. New aircraft gleam in the pale sunlight. Jets with swept wings, metal skins polished smooth, shapes that seem to belong to a different age entirely. And yet, when the de Havilland Mosquito taxis into view, a murmur ripples through the spectators. It does not look modern. Not beside the jets. Not beside the angular prototypes promising supersonic futures. Its lines are elegant but familiar. Its construction rooted in a war that already feels distant. And still, people lean forward. Veterans nudge one another. Some smile. Some grow quiet. They remember. When the Mosquito takes off, it does so without drama. No thunderclap, no shockwave. Just the steady surge of 2 Merlin engines and the smooth lift of an aircraft that has done this hundreds of times before. It climbs with ease, banking gracefully, as if to remind everyone watching that speed and grace are not inventions of the jet age. For a brief moment, the war feels close again. Behind the scenes, however, decisions are already being made. Air forces around the world are standardizing around metal construction and jet propulsion. Wood, once a necessity, is now seen as a liability. Skilled craftsmen are aging out of the workforce. Factories that once pressed plywood fuselages are retooling or closing altogether. The Mosquito's time is ending. In Canada and Australia, Mosquito squadrons linger a little longer, flying patrols, training missions, mapping vast territories from the air. In Britain, a few specialized units continue to operate the aircraft into the late 1940s, valued for their reliability and range. But one by one, the squadrons disband. The aircraft are struck off charge. Many are burned. Wood does not store well. It warps, absorbs moisture, degrades. Maintaining mosquitoes in peacetime is expensive and impractical. Engines are pulled. Instruments removed. Airframes are dismantled and destroyed. To the men who flew them, it feels wrong, like erasing something that had earned the right to endure. A few survive by chance or stubbornness. Museum curators argue for preservation. Former pilots lobby quietly. An aircraft here is set aside for instructional use. Another is forgotten in a hangar, protected from the weather by nothing more than neglect. Decades later, these survivors will become priceless, not because they are rare machines, but because they embody a way of thinking that briefly, brilliantly worked. As aviation historians begin to reassess the Second World War, the Mosquito's reputation grows rather than fades. It is no longer just a successful aircraft. It becomes a case study. Military planners note how it forced adversaries to react disproportionately. Engineers study its composite construction, decades before composites become fashionable again. Strategists point to its missions as early examples of precision strike doctrine, the idea that carefully targeted force, applied at the right moment, can achieve strategic effects without overwhelming destruction. Even stealth theorists take notice. The Mosquito's small radar signature, once an incidental benefit of its wooden construction, begins to look prophetic. The idea that materials and shape could reduce detectability becomes central to Cold War aircraft design. The Mosquito had not been built to be stealthy, but it had benefited from the concept all the same. For the men who designed it, there is quiet vindication. Geoffrey de Havilland does not live to see the full extent of the Mosquito's legacy, but his philosophy endures. Simplicity, efficiency, trust in aerodynamics over brute force. In a world rushing toward complexity, those ideas remain stubbornly relevant. For the crews who flew it, the legacy is more personal. At reunions, decades after the war, former Mosquito pilots and navigators trade stories that sound almost unbelievable to younger ears. Daylight raids over Berlin alone, flying faster than enemy fighters, navigating by rivers and church towers at treetop height, trusting speed instead of guns. They speak of fear, yes, but also of confidence, of an aircraft that felt alive beneath them, of missions where everything depended on seconds and judgment, of coming home when others did not. When asked what made the Mosquito special, many struggle to find the right words. Some say it was the speed, others the versatility, others still the way it made them feel, capable, agile, one step ahead of an enemy that never quite caught up. All of them agree on one thing: no one laughed once it mattered. The wooden airplane had earned its place, not through spectacle but through results. It had slipped through defenses, rewritten assumptions, and saved lives by refusing to fight the way everyone expected it to. And in doing so, it left behind a lesson that outlived the war itself. Innovation is not always loud. Sometimes it hums. Long after the last Mosquito is grounded, long after the Merlins fall silent for good, the aircraft continues to fly, on drawing boards, in war colleges, in arguments between engineers who never once touched its controls. In the early 1950s, a new generation of officers studies the Second World War not as memory but as data. They sift through mission reports, loss rates, interception logs. Patterns emerge that cannot be ignored. Heavy bombers suffered catastrophic attrition when speed and surprise were lost. Fighters dominated when agility and performance exceeded expectations. And one aircraft, again and again, appears as an outlier: the Mosquito. It does not fit the prevailing post-war narrative of bigger, faster, heavier as an inevitable march of progress. Instead, it represents a fork in the road, a reminder that there was another way to think about air power. One that prioritized initiative over protection, precision over saturation, and flexibility over specialization. In quiet briefing rooms, instructors point to Mosquito operations as examples of what modern air forces should aspire to: independent action, multi-role adaptability, mission-specific design. The idea that a single platform, properly conceived, could disrupt an enemy far beyond its numbers. This thinking seeps outward. In the United States, early Cold War planners wrestling with nuclear delivery systems debate survivability versus speed. In Europe, NATO air forces consider how to operate under the shadow of Soviet air defenses. In both cases, the Mosquito's wartime record becomes a reference point, not as a blueprint but as proof that assumptions can be broken. Even materials science circles back. By the late 20th century, aerospace engineers rediscover what de Havilland's team had proven under wartime pressure. Composites can be strong, light, and resilient. Carbon fiber replaces plywood. Epoxy replaces wartime glue. But the principle is the same. Shape, structure, and material working together to serve performance. The Mosquito, once mocked as primitive, begins to look quietly modern. In museums, visitors stand beneath preserved airframes and read placards that summarize its achievements in neat paragraphs. Fastest operational aircraft of its time. Multiple roles. Low loss rates. High impact. The facts are impressive, but they cannot fully convey what it meant to see one in the sky when it mattered. Veterans know the difference. They remember the sound first. Not the thunder of massed bombers, but the clean, confident note of Merlins at full power. They remember the way the aircraft surged forward when asked, how it seemed to anticipate their intentions. They remember missions flown alone, without escorts, trusting speed and planning where others trusted armor and numbers. They also remember the disbelief. The first time someone laughed at the idea of a wooden bomber. The first time intelligence reports suggested the Germans did not take it seriously. The moment that laughter turned into confusion, then anger, then fear. Wars are full of moments like that when certainty collapses. For Germany, the Mosquito represented more than a tactical problem. It was a psychological one. It symbolized the failure of rigid thinking in the face of improvisation. It exposed how doctrine, once hardened into dogma, becomes a vulnerability. For Britain, it became a quiet triumph. Not a weapon of annihilation, but a weapon of disruption. One that allowed a smaller force to punch far above its weight. One that saved lives by refusing to fight fair. One that embodied a national response to scarcity. Adapt, innovate, and trust skill over mass. In the end, the Mosquito's greatest achievement may not be measured in tons of bombs dropped or aircraft destroyed, but in questions asked. What if we remove the guns instead of adding more? What if speed is better protection than armor? What if the enemy's expectations are their weakest point? Those questions echo long after the war. They echo every time an engineer challenges a requirement. Every time a planner discards a comfortable assumption. Every time an idea sounds ridiculous until it works. The de Havilland Mosquito was never supposed to succeed. It was laughed at because it contradicted everything powerful institutions believed to be true. And yet, in the cold skies over Europe, under fire and under pressure, it proved that those beliefs were not laws of nature, only habits. When the laughter stopped, it was already too late. The wooden airplane had done its work.